Hi, Davey again. How are you doing today? So, early this week, I started talking about composition technique in functional programming. And the idea there was basically to show you different composition technique you can use in your JavaScript application. Yeah, I said JavaScript because examples here are in JavaScript. If you don't do JavaScript, I'm gonna put a link in the video right there where you can find links for other languages and how you can use it right there. So, but the code here is very generic, so stick around and just enjoy. I've already done in the past a video about partial function, and here I'm gonna quickly go through it and then go quickly to the next step, which is currying, right, and auto currying, right? Let's stick around. So here we have this idea of partial function. A quick story about partial function is a few years ago, I went for an interview at a job, and the interviewer asked me something. When I arrived, the first thing they told me is like, look at this. We're gonna give you a sum, and then give you this, and then this. And they were like, well, how would you implement this? And this there should return 6, right? You're summing two numbers. Why is it written like that? It is written like that because right there you have this idea of partial function. What is it? The idea there is you have this first function, which is sum. So let's create that function. That takes one argument, and then it's going to return something, right? The thing that it's returned is another function that itself takes an argument, and you can change that infinitely, basically. So how do you do so? Right here, you just say, well, now you're going to have y, and then you just need to then add x plus y, right? So if we look at this, like this, we should see that that thing gives us 6 as a result, right? So really, partial functions are this idea of like you split the system into smaller chunks, and then you make sure that each part of the system is providing you one single thing or a few things, right? It doesn't matter if it's 1 or 2, 3 parameters, right? But at least you make sure that the next one's gonna provide you a few more parameters. For example, sum here, you can say, okay, you have x here, which is a number, right, basically, and then you're going to have y, which is a number, but then next to it you can then add something like 3 dot args, and then you said this is gonna be an array of number, right? So if you do so, then you know that here you can pass something like 2, 3, and then how would you solve that? Well, the point here is not really about, it's not about writing the code of sum. The point here is to show you that the second, the third, the fourth can basically have access to as many arguments as you want. The point being, like when you call sum the first time, so sum3, for example, I'm gonna create a function that is called sum3. So how is that? How am I going to define sum3? Well, you just call sum and then you pass 3. Which means that now, right here, when I call sum3, it still works, right? It's gonna give me 6 because right there I already kind of created a constant that is sum3, right? That returns 3 each time, and then whenever you pass it a new argument, it will just sum them, right? And that's the idea of partial functions, and they are really useful. So I'm gonna give you an example of where partial functions are used in JavaScript. So let me do this. Now in JavaScript, for example, you're going to have, let's say an object here, let's call it user, right? And that user has a name, and well, the name here, well, we're going to say Xavier because, well, that's my little boy. And then you're going to say friends, for example, or brothers or sisters, or I'm just trying to find an example. I'm gonna give you an example there that will leverage this idea of partial functions, right? So okay, I have a user, has a name, pretty good, and let's say add a class, right? We just basically add that person into a class. So I'm gonna use here a function, and then whenever you give the name of the class, a name of the class, which is a string, you just, what you're going to do is basically say here you have a list of classes or courses, the way you, doesn't matter the way you want to do that. And then now what do? You basically say for these classes, so I'm just gonna say this dot classes, and I'm just going to push there the name of class, right? So that's what I get. Basically that will be the way to use it. So if I go here and then I say user dot name, so you see that this one here, it returns Xavier. And then if I say then user, then add class, right? And then I say add JavaScript, because I want him to learn JavaScript, actually TypeScript. Let's make it fun, right? So what's going to happen here if I do user, I'm going to see that the class has now this idea of the class has the TypeScript in there, right? Now look at this. What I mean by partial function is basically a mechanism where you're going to say I want to make sure that this here reference something completely different. Now it is something you've probably used in JavaScript or you've never really paid attention to it, but here I'm gonna make sure that I show you that mechanism. So in JavaScript there is a thing called prototype object a prototype dot bind. All right, there is a function bind in JavaScript that you can use to basically do this idea of a partial function. So how do you do so? I'm gonna show you first why you will need it. So now I'm going to create a function that is called add class, right? And that function there will just be a copy of this one, right? Does that make sense, right? You see that that's just a function, right? Now if I say add class and then I pass okay, you can see right away that when I call add class, that thing completely crashes, right? It does crash, and you don't have really a control over this because I'm using the keyword this over here. By the way, if you don't understand what I'm doing right here, you gotta watch one of my fundamental video where I talk about the this keyword. Okay, we're gonna put it in the comment right there. So this here crashes. It crashes because it's in, it says class cannot read property of undefined. But before, the example we had was basically we were saying we had user, and then we will say user add TypeScript here, right? And then when we look at user, well, when this line didn't crash. There's something there. That line didn't crash, but the line right below didn't crash. What is the main thing? Well, the main difference. The main difference here is when you call this one, the this here become user because it is written user over here, right? That's what is basically happening behind the scene. Right here, when you call on line 22, on line 22, this one here becomes undefined, and that's why that thing is crashing. So some people, when they if you use a library like React or framework like Angular, you probably saw something that looks like this, where people just say bind, and then they call the function bind, and then they basically apply that onto something. So let's use that here to solve this problem. Here I'm going to create an array, which is basically classes, right? It's an array of elements here, and then right there what I'm going to do is to say we're going to bind we're going to bind the this. So the here is actually not really correct. What I need to do here is I'm going to say just have an object, and that object here just pass it that class right here. And now here what I'm going to say, I'm calling bind, and bind, I will pass it that object. So now you see all the errors are gone. All the errors are gone. There you should ask yourself, what just happened? So what just happened here on line 24 is bind is a partial function. What it does, technically, it goes right below and then it's going to rewrite that function. So let me go completely at the bottom. It's going to rewrite that function right here, and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to rewrite that function, and whatever I receive right here will become the thing that goes in here. That is basically what happens. So it means that it prevents, it's going to replace every single every keyword this it finds in the function that is being called from. It will go and replace any this there with that thing here. So that's why it's not crashing. And now if you look at obj, you're going to see that here we're gonna say react, and then you see now that that obj there receive that element. That's partial function. That's what partial function, the way you use partial function in JavaScript. It's a powerful concept. It's probably not that obvious when you see it on day-to-day, but that actually, this is something that you're gonna face in your application, right? So this is it for now. On the next video, I'm going to talk about this idea of currying. You stay with me? Cheers.